I won't take time other than to hand over to Elisabeth.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to recognise on behalf of the panel that this can actually be quite a challenging session within the day, can't it? Some of you have already gone. I have a feeling that others of you are kind of worried about kind of this running over and missing trains and things like that. We completely respect and understand if anyone has to leave during this session, and I've warned the panel, please don't take it personally. That's the kind of thinking. Nonetheless, challenging though this session is, it's incredibly valuable too. And that's for two main reasons. The first is you can't possibly be in two places at once. So when you came to choosing which of those breakout sessions to attend, and you might have kind of felt torn, with a little bit of luck, you will hear just a little bit of feedback from a co-chair from a session that you couldn't attend. So you'll get a little bit of a sense of the insight that came from it. And the second reason is that this is quite a precious chance just to have a little bit of reflective time at the end of the day to draw together a little bit kind of what you've heard. You've heard a very diverse, wide range of issues kind of covered. There is no shortage of areas that you've heard about. There's a great deal of innovation, and necessity has kind of led to that, hasn't it? So it's helpful just to spend a small amount of time at the end of the day just thinking about what happens next in terms of how that's prioritised. Now, to do that, I'm joined by the panel on stage, precisely with the preciousness of time in mind. I'm not even going to introduce them. What I'm going to say is there's breadth, there's depth, and there's cross-sectoral understanding. You can read the rest in your programmes. I'm also going to be aided in this final session by the co-chairs from the breakout sessions, and that's what we're going to start with actually, is kind of hearing some insight from each of those sessions. Now, some of you will have spotted I said a little bit quite frequently just now, didn't I? Co-chairs of the breakout sessions, you have been warned. I have been informed that Robin has said to you it is 2 points. Dare I say it to this room, 2 points does not include a subclause. It does include just 2 points. So I'm going to ask, firstly, can we have feedback from the first session, which was in relation to information collection with a specific focus on vulnerable people in the justice system? I think that's Barry.
2 points. First point is that data may be collected in relation to those who engage in the system, but data is not collected about those who do not engage in the system. Those who, in fact, who find engagement a barrier, those we should be seeking to assist. We haven't got an answer, but that's clearly an important point for people to reflect upon. The second point is that with data, what we tend to look at is, this is the data, this is the problem, this is how we may remedy it, whereas in fact it doesn't and can't measure fairness. And there is no substitute for those engaged in the system at all levels, helping against or for parties, judges, court staff, for recognising all elements of vulnerability and seeking to do the best that's possible within what we recognise it is not and is not going to be a fair system.
No. There's a message there, so don't let perfect data be the enemy of the good a little bit, isn't there? Nancy, we're going to come to you because you actually attended this breakout session as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting session for me to be part of. I lead a charitable foundation that funds community groups, mostly in the northeast of England, many of whom are working with people who have issues with accessing justice, and most of their clients would be deemed vulnerable. And we had a really rich conversation in our breakout about that definition of vulnerability and the unhelpfulness of the label a lot of the time. And we talked about the fact that vulnerability includes situational vulnerability that any of us could face at any time in our life. And one person in the panel, Alison Lamb, was saying that it is often funders like me, she didn't say that, but it is true, who instill a need for that language to be used because we want to know how many vulnerable people organisations are serving. And it was a really helpful challenge to me as a funder, and I think is one that you should raise with other funders, because as a body of funders, we should not be those who are asking you to use language that labels the very people that you're trying to help. The other thing that came up that I found really interesting was a conversation around the need to break down barriers between litigants and lawyers, and it reminded me of a story that I was told fairly recently from one of our funded organisations about a woman who was going through the court system, multiple perpetrators, quite complex case, and the judge actually met with her beforehand and showed her the entrance to the court, where she'd come in, where the media would be, where her perpetrators would be, even talked to her about, I usually wear a gown and a headpiece, I can't think of the word, a wig, that's the word, and asked her how she'd feel about that, should she wear something different instead. And I just think those conversations about how you break down barriers are incredibly useful.
Thank you, Nancy. So Nicholas, what about from your perspective?
Yes. Well, I chaired this Justice report on understanding courts, and we spent about 6 to 9 months discussing the notion of vulnerability, and eventually we came, I think, collectively to the conclusion that every person who doesn't have professional legal assistance is to some extent vulnerable in the courts and tribunals, simply for that reason alone. But there are, of course, people who are particularly vulnerable, statutorily vulnerable, and other definitions. And part of the work in civil justice was to look at what, surprisingly, in the criminal justice had taken as the lead, as opposed to the family or other areas of the system of justice where you might have thought these would have been long-going problems, and try to bring some of the insights and the experiences across from a jurisdiction where these are statutorily defined concepts into civil justice where they're not. But I do think it's important that if we're using that word, it doesn't have a technical definition, and it recognises that what we're trying to do is to face the disadvantage that anybody who doesn't have professional legal assistance faces in navigating any form of a claim, whether we think it's a simple one or a complicated one. I'm afraid the professionals who are vulnerable, well, they're being paid to be vulnerable, and they're just going to have to get on with it. The second point that I picked up in that discussion, and it related to something I heard earlier this morning, was the notion of participation and barriers to participation. One of the recommendations of the Justice report was that the overriding objective be amended to include expressly the object of facilitating effective participation. I was very pleased to hear from Barry that that is also a recommendation that the Civil Justice Council is making, although the judgment on that will be for the Rules Committee. I certainly hope that they adopt that. Clearly, one can spend a lot of time on what is participation, but if that is identified as an aim of the system and a duty on both parties to promote that aim of the system, that gives you some hook for the judge troubled with a lot of overwork of cases to point to something, to say, you've got to assist me to ensure that everyone can participate effectively. So I think it would be a really missed opportunity if the Rules Committee do not adopt that recommendation. They may be judicially reviewed if they don't, so I hope they don't get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let us move on to hear from the co-chairs from Breakout 2, which was taking public legal education to scale. I think we're going to hear from Amanda, who's at the front here. Thank you.
We talked about how we could take public legal education to scale. Now, of course, there's been a great deal of public legal education rolled out in schools, and what became apparent during the discussion was a huge degree of nervousness from lawyers about going beyond the safe environment of schools with students sitting nicely in rows into the more terrifying environment of the community. And I think this is something which we actually need to think about quite hard and address quite strategically, using the lessons learned from schools, which is you give the lawyer a pack that they're going to deliver, you give them an assistant who knows the particular school or community, and you recognise that lawyers, by the time they're doing this, will be very highly specialised in one particular area and will not feel they're masters of all the problems that could be thrown at them. So our take-home from that was, if you're going to get lawyers into the community, get them to talk to trusted intermediaries who, on the whole, are a much safer bunch than members of the community, as it were, in the raw. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Amanda. Anna, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm disadvantaged by not having been in that session on the basis of the principle that you can't be in two places at once. But I mean, I think it almost goes without saying, certainly in this environment, that public legal education has got to be a big part of the answer to the problems that we face, particularly because it's been identified elsewhere today that knowing that you even have a case is often a barrier to any kind of access to justice. If you don't know that you have a right or that there's a law that applies, then there's no way that you're going to be able to effectively make sure that that right is properly applied. And I think that I would plug my sort of own key thing that I like to do, which is to make comparisons with other jurisdictions. And I think that public legal education is one in which there is a lot to be learned from other jurisdictions, both in terms of how the school syllabus, the compulsory syllabus, can be made to contain a lot of information, particularly during citizenship type courses or equivalent, but also in terms of how information can be got out to particularly vulnerable groups. There's good work, for example, in Denmark, which I won't go into now, about trying to get legal education out to homeless people, for example. So I think that learning from other countries is definitely helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna. Let's hear now from the third breakout session, which looked at digital support, assisted digital. And who are we hearing from on this? Thank you.
Hello. The third one, I wasn't a co-chair, but one co-chair has had to leave, and one co-chair is under purdah. So two facts. Just forgive me for 1 second. Somebody said to me, by the way, assisted digital or digital support reminds me of a quote from Antonio Gramsci, which is that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. Think about it. Anyway, so number one, HMCTS has learned the most important lesson: you can't separate out digital support from other types of support, and particularly legal and advice support. Number one. Number two, linked to that, is there are organisations, there are people already doing it, as in combine those two things. There's expertise that exists, there are people that know what works in and around the advice sector, broadly speaking, and we are, the advice sector, are happy and should be engaged in strategic, formative discussions with what happens with digital support post the pilot that is now running. So 2 points. Thank you.
So far with the co-chairs. Thank you very much indeed. Christian, I think you attended this session, so what are your thoughts?
I did. So I found this a fascinating discussion. I think it's obvious that many people in need cannot live just on self-serve tools. And that doesn't require much discussion, and quite possibly the majority of people who require legal support cannot live on self-serve tools alone. Nevertheless, I, having spent the last 20 years in digital information for people in the legal industry, have painfully experienced myself how hard it is and how long it takes to get to excellent usability for users who are professionals in the field with legal information tools. And we've been very bad at LexisNexis at this for a while, and we've gotten better over time, and now we're much better than we were some years ago, and I'm not going to mark my own homework here really, but and I think this is one of those stories. I think self-service tools in the legal advice space, in the free legal advice space, have a place. It's not for everybody, it's probably not for the majority, but it's for enough people, given the numbers we're talking about, hundreds of thousands and probably millions a year. There are large numbers out there who will, for a meaningful piece of what they do or what they require, benefit from self-service tools. Let's not throw the baby out of the bathwater. And I do think it is important it has a place. And equally, assisted digital assistance has its place for many other people.
Thank you very much for that. And last but by no means least, I think we're having feedback from Justice Laing with regard to bringing together the meeting of the litigant in person support judges.
Well, Matthew Nicklin and I were delighted that a group of really committed and enthusiastic judges were able to come at relatively short notice to the session, and they were marvellous. So we had a really interesting discussion. That's not point number one or point number two, it's just an introduction.
I shall allow that.
Point number one, which came out of the discussion, was that the politicians really do need to rethink legal aid in private family cases. And this is not about there being no legal aid, it is the paradox of asymmetrical provision. And we think there's a real Article 6 problem coming down the track. And I think if this went to Strasbourg, United Kingdom might well be found in breach of Article 6. So that was the first point that came out of the discussion. The second point that came out of the discussion, I mean, these are the main important points, was that in many courts, district judges in particular, are working under enormous pressure. They are being given unfeasibly long lists to deal with in a day. Some of them are sitting late regularly, some of them are having to work every weekend, and that compounds the problems which they have in dealing with litigants in person. And they're also subject to targets by HMCTS about how they get through the work. So the second point is that there need to be more sitting days in the county court.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Justice Laing. What I'm going to do at that point is open things up to the panel, actually, who've kind of patiently been reflecting on their responses with regard to the breakout sessions. Interesting that even given the fact that those were, particularly if you think of the first three different breakout sessions, real kind of synergy and kind of overlap, isn't there, kind of in the feedback that is coming through. What I wanted to do now is kind of open things up to the panel, and really I think we'd all be interested in hearing your wider thoughts on the day. What are the standout points? Have you heard what you were expecting, really? Any surprises? Let's start with Nancy.
Yeah, I think for me there were two standout points from the day that I'd want to bring back to your attention at the end of the day. And before I do, though, if it's okay, I'll tell you a story. And before I ran a charitable foundation, I was chief exec of a homelessness charity, and we worked with women who were homeless, and particularly young women in the northeast of England. And one day, about 7 years ago, I got a call from the police saying that they had a young woman who required housing. She had no recourse to public funds, and so they hadn't been able to get her into a refuge, and she'd been trafficked into this country, exploited repeatedly, and they couldn't deport her because she was needed to testify in the court case. But they had nowhere to place her because she couldn't go into a refuge, and she was 18 and needed suitable housing. So we did what we do as a homelessness charity. We housed her, and in the end we had her for about 3 years whilst that court process went through. And this was a young woman who was susceptible to further grooming. She had lots of circumstances that made her very vulnerable. And my point really is that the funding for her support and her housing wasn't there. It was piecemeal at best, but it wasn't there in a sustained way. And this was a woman who needed emotional support, housing, social support for the period of time while that court case went through. And so I think my 2 points from the day that I've taken away was firstly, a point that was made early on about the fact that access to justice isn't just about the court outcome. It's about the whole process. It's about victims being heard. It is about the court outcome, but it's also about them then being able to recover and to rebuild their lives. Before I came here, I was reading a study from the University of Bristol from Marianne Hester that made those points, and I think it's so borne out by the experiences that I witnessed working with those young women. The second point is very related, and that's that the road to justice through the courts can be long, but the road to recovery is longer still. And Lizzie Iron mentioned when she was speaking about the funding gap for those support services that walk alongside people as they're going through the court processes and beyond. And I think my second takeaway point is the real need to safeguard those important services in this time where so much is being cut. And as charitable funders, we play a role in that. But safeguarding those organisations who can offer that emotional support cannot be overlooked.
Christian.
Yeah, so I wasn't able to attend the morning. I was able to attend the afternoon, but had a couple of conversations to get a sense for what was said in the morning. And one of the comments that was relayed to me is that somebody said, I've come here for 8 years and nothing much has changed. And I can't personally comment on that because I haven't come here for 8 years. I've been peripherally involved in conversations with Robin for 2 or 3 years maybe. But I can see how driving change is very challenging. And it's very challenging, I think, because A, this is an incredibly complex problem that no country in the world has probably solved properly, talking about the comparison study that Anna's doing. But also because it's structurally difficult, because there are so many different participants, and there's so little funding for most of the participants. And so this is a fiendishly complex problem. And frustrations that emerge with panacea solutions like, let's go digital, and that's gonna change everything, will naturally bubble up at that time. And I think what is important is to think about what can we do differently going forward than what we've done over the past 8 years. And surely a good amount of very positive change has happened anyway, but what can we do differently going forward? And so as I think about structural opportunities, I do think there are some things that, and this is my area of expertise, which is why I comment on it, that digital can uniquely do. And digital can and has in so many industries increased productivity. That means more output per time invested. And I cannot believe that it is not going to be the case in the advice sector. And I do not say it's a panacea or it's easy, but certainly enabling more throughput in the system with existing funding through tools that help advisors on the front line has to be an opportunity that works. The other thing that digitally uniquely does in so many sectors, including Love Life, is matchmaking. And there will be, more often than not, I'm sure, and I don't know this because I haven't felt it on the front line, but I'm structurally must believe that to be true. There will be many situations where people turn up at a clinic for a particular piece of advice and they speak to somebody who doesn't have the expertise. And there was a really telling comment made in the breakout that I attended, which is people only go once or twice to a clinic or to get help. And if that doesn't suit, they're not going to turn up the third time. They're just going to throw the towel. And so making sure that the first time they turn up, they meet the right person is absolutely critical. And digital has, around the world, in so many different areas, proven to be an absolute game changer in matchmaking. And I have to believe that there is an opportunity in that space here as well. And then the final piece is what the breakout that I attended directly commented on, which is self-serve. And I made that comment earlier. Self-serve is definitely not for everybody, but it is good for some people. And given the scale we're talking about, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, that are in need, there probably is a good return to get self-serve right, and it does take time. Self-serve is very hard to get right, especially with a complex problem like this. Sydney and her work, is tremendous, and there are some learnings that you've had, and so, it will take time, but there is a role for self-serve. And so there are unique and transformational contributions that digital can make in these three areas, and probably more. Let's not throw the towel, and let's figure out how we can, through probably a coordinated approach across the multiple participants in the sector, how we can actually achieve the biggest impact through digital going forward. That's where I might comment.
Christian. So Nicholas, your reflections on the day.
Yes. This is the second year I've attended this conference. The last was, in fact, a month before the Justice report was published, and we were able to listen then and make some final tweaks to the direction of travel in our recommendations. What I've heard throughout the day reflects one of the topics that we discussed in our report, and that is court language. We divided our report into 3 sections, and the second was called Communicating with Lay Users. And we've heard lots of issues being raised by everybody, from judges to litigants in person to other organisations, about the problems of language, of court language in particular, being a barrier to communication and a barrier to effective participation, which seems to me to grab the concept that we're trying to deploy and work with. And effective communication, we identify in that report, is in a number of ways. Oral communication, the language that is used, the language of the rules and the practice directions themselves, and also in written communication, the language of judgments. And those seem to be an issue which still needs to be attended to in judicial training and advocacy training in the civil justice sector, just as it has in the criminal justice sector. And I think that's a real priority for work over the next 12 months and 2 years. It's possible, although always difficult, particularly for lawyers, to think, well, I'm now speaking in simple language and you're bound to understand what I'm saying now, when of course it's the input from the user that we most need as to what they think is necessary. But on a more positive phrase, one of the core judgments of this year was, of course, the Supreme Court's decision on the prorogation judgment. And for me, as an ex-judge listening to that decision live, the clarity of the language, the simple phrasing, the shortness of the judgment was an education for every citizen of the country in constitutional law. And that seemed to be an ambition to aim at. And it's important that our highest court, our Supreme Court, were able to achieve it. I know at the other end of the scale, many tribunals have significantly greater experience of working with litigants in person in particular fields of expertise, and are used to explaining and getting the best evidence back from the users in order to inform decisions. But there was, at the very top of the judicial ladder, a clear example of good communication. So I hope that is a topic which can be taken forward over the next period and to improve the training for advocates and judges, and to ensure that the principles are set out in the Equal Opportunities Handbook and the Equal Treatment Handbook are actually being applied in practice.
Last but not least, Anna. And Anna, no pressure, but actually you were my standout quote from last year. And for those of you who did attend, it was Anna who came up with that wonderful quote, "Justice is not a fruit salad, it's a cake." So with that in mind, over to Anna.
To explain.
I leave it entirely to you.
I think I might just leave that hanging, actually. I think picking up on Christian's analogy of not throwing in the towel, but in a slightly different context, I think one of my main takeouts from today was the comment from the floor earlier, then picked up on in some senses by Lucy, talking about the IBA and World Bank report, that we shouldn't give up on legal aid. And I think that it sounds as if that IBA and World Bank report might be a very useful piece of ammunition to counter arguments about there not being enough money for legal aid. If we can show that, in fact, we save money with legal aid rather than spending money with legal aid, I think that we need to not throw in the towel with regard to legal aid. I think the other takeaway for me from the day is more sort of general, maybe more diverse, which is that on several occasions during the day, I found myself thinking sort of little light bulbs lighting up above my head when I realised things were similar or not similar in other jurisdictions. And as ever, would like to encourage people not to reinvent the wheel. We shouldn't assume that we're ahead of the curve on this stuff, because often we're actually not. We like to think in this jurisdiction that we're the best. But we haven't got all the answers, and some other jurisdictions might have answers that would be really useful. And in that respect, I would encourage you all to look forward to the second half of next year, when we should have the data in from the Global Access to Justice report. It's descriptive data rather than statistical data, but we're gathering together national reports, regional reports and thematic reports from over 90 jurisdictions around the world in a way that we hope will make it very easy for people to make comparisons in just the types of information that are interesting to them. So if you want to compare legal expenses insurance in Papua New Guinea, Norway and Spain, it'll be easy to do that using the method that we're using for this report. So yeah, let's not only learn from each other within this room and this conference, which I think is a great strength of this conference every year, but also let's continue to learn from each other more widely, both in this jurisdiction and beyond.
Thank you very much, Anna. Final very quick question to the panel, and indeed I think a number of you have kind of probably picked up on this, but we're about to hand back to Robin and Sam Allan as they reflect on kind of what this means going forward. So my question to you in a way to kind of help them with that is, what do you think should be prioritised in the year ahead to deliver that step change, that scalability point that we've heard during the day in terms of access to justice? What one thing, Christian?
Again, I have no expertise in the wider areas. My expertise is in digital. I do think there is an incredible amount of good work going on in the different areas. I do think the central coordination and central leadership point outside of the work that is happening on the kind of court reform and a digital court work, which is quite central, but it's a central node for that. Coordination and impetus, I think, is essential to avoid that the advice sector in 5 years' time we might consider digitally left behind because nobody ever gave them $1 billion to transform their sector, and the law firm sector will have done it on their own. The judiciary or the MOJ has done their own billion spending, but the advice sector that has the majority of the volume hasn't been given the money and has on an individual basis made good progress, but not the transformational progress that might be possible.
One thing.
I think for me it would be around the participation point and ensuring that experts by experience or litigants or whatever language you use are leading voices within the reform that takes place.
Thank you. Sir Nicholas.
Yes, court language is a barrier to effective participation.
Thank you very much. And Anna.
Don't be afraid to learn from others.
Don't be afraid to learn from others. All, can you please join me in both thanking the panel and indeed the co-chairs of the breakout session? Robin and Sam, on time and with hopefully quite a helpful steer as well from the panel, we hand back to you.
Thanks, Elisabeth. Hello, I'm Sam Allan. I am Secretary to the Civil Justice Council and Private Secretary to the Master of the Rolls. When I took up post earlier this year, I asked Graham what I should look out for, and without hesitation he said, the National Forum. Over the last few weeks I thought I knew what he meant, but now I've been here and I've seen it, I've got a much better understanding of what he actually meant. Thank you all for your contributions over the course of today. As Secretary of the Civil Justice Council, I am proud of today, and have been really proud today, because it's a fantastic example of the work that the CJC does and how we seek to fulfil our statutory purpose. Together, we have heard directly today how important it is that we continue, again together, to make the civil justice system more accessible, more fair and efficient. Most importantly, therefore, we've convened, and I very much believe that the CJC exists because the collective effort is greater than the sum of our parts. That is what the CJC is all about. I hope our council members are, after all, well-respected individuals in their own right, but it is the work we do together which is most important. And I hope next year we'll be able to share much more of that work with you. Today has trailed work on vulnerable persons, on antisocial behaviour injunctions, but we're also doing some work, I hope, on pre-action protocols, periodical payment orders, low-value PI claims, and many other areas, not neglecting, of course, the ongoing work of the Access to Justice Working Group. Of course, we've heard what has been said about the importance of a central node to coordinate all of that. We've heard the importance of the use of data and how data can help us do that work better. We've heard the importance of getting our language right and how we talk about what we think and ultimately how we articulate how we work together to improve things. After all, ultimately, we are there for all of you. And on that note, it would be wrong, I'll keep it very brief, I'm sure you all want to join the protest outside. It would be wrong for me not to thank a number of people. Firstly, Portia and her team here at the Central Methodist Hall, thank you. We literally couldn't be here without you. The team from Rubber Ears, who filmed today, will thank you now, and we look forward to seeing your work in due course. Thank you. Now the people who've lived today for longest, the CJC team, Lee and Graham. Graham especially, who has now done all 8 of the national forums. He is delighted every year when the Master of the Rolls says this one's going to be the biggest yet. But Lee and Graham have also been supported today by Caris, Noella, Jan, Maya, Sarah, Kathy, Caroline and Suya. Perhaps if you could all stand up and wave and we can all show our appreciation to you. Finally, last but certainly not least, Robin. The Master of the Rolls was right to describe you as the Ringmaster-in-Chief today. It wouldn't have been possible without you. Many of you will already know, but Robin is a generous, kind, and frequently inspiring person to work with. But that all said, I know that the best thanks we can offer you after today is actually to take the expertise we've shared and the connections that we've made and to go and do something with them. So thank you all.
Thanks so much for making today. Thanks so much for everything you've put in today. Thank you, Sam, for everything you've said, but also thank you, Sam, for your leadership as the Secretary of the Civil Justice Council. Thank you to the working group of members of the Civil Justice Council that is behind this and our continuing effort across the year. Thank you all prospectively for the work ahead. Taking as a guide, taking a lead from what the closing panel, so ably chaired by Elisabeth, has identified. Please get the date in your diary for next year. Please bring back stories of progress, new ideas, greater collaboration. Please be ready to bring your colleagues in this area of endeavour. Please be ready to think internationally across this year, as Anna Barlow encouraged. We can, I have no doubt, collectively continue, and I use the word continue, to make progress. We have made progress. There is a long way to go, but actually there's also no alternative. We have to keep going, and if we do approach things in that way, real change will come. That's our privilege to respond to. Thanks so much to everyone. See you next year.